Hello and welcome. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's now a cliche phrase that's been repeated in reference to conflicts across the globe. But the word terrorist has certainly changed since September the 11th, 2001, becoming heavily politicized and often draws a heated response, but for often different reasons depending on the viewpoint. Violent actions are becoming more and more an avenue of expression in political conflicts old and new. Whether it's bombings in London, attacks on New York City, or shootings in Israel, all have been condemned as terrorist acts by some, while being lauded as heroic feats by others. And those who perpetuate the violence say they are legitimate combatants fighting for what they believe in by whatever means possible. Yet a victim of those acts sees them as criminals with no regard for human life. Without a universal definition of terrorism, how can we define who, quote, terrorists are? We want your input into the debate. Don't forget, we take your calls on this show, and you can reach us at the numbers on the bottom of your screen. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're joined by Dr. Louise Richardson, the Executive Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, where she's focused on international security. Her book, What Terrorists Want: Understanding the Enemy, Containing the Threat, looks at patterns of terrorist violence and the best strategy to counter them. And joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Dr. Jerrold Post, the director of the George Washington University Political Psychology Program. In his latest book, The Mind of the Terrorist, The Psychology of Terrorism from the IRA to Al-Qaeda, he demonstrates how understanding the mind of those who commit violent acts can help combat future terrorism. Good to have you both with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Dr. Richardson, I mean, this is a question to both, but Dr. Richardson, I'll start with you on this one. I guess we should start by defining the word terrorist, what it means, because I guess that definition really has taken a new meaning since George W. Bush declared his so-called war on terror. And I guess we should find out what the definition is nowadays.
Well, I'm not sure that I would entirely agree that it's taken a new meaning. I think terrorism is quite simply the deliberate targeting of non-combatants for a political purpose. I think where the confusion arises is that because the term is so loaded, nobody wants to label a group whose goals they consider legitimate a terrorist group, even when they deliberately target civilians to achieve those goals. So I would argue that we need to separate out the means that are used from the goals that are being sought. So we should be prepared to call a group which deliberately targets civilians to achieve their ends a terrorist group, even if we agree with the ends that they're trying to achieve.
Well, Dr. Richardson, if I could put to you then, if it comes down to a government doing that, for example, if a government is, let's take Tiananmen Square, for example, how would you define what the Chinese government was doing there?
Well, I think if a government deliberately targets civilians, in that instance, they're engaging in a war crime. Or they're engaging. We have generations of work of political scientists and international lawyers to help us adjudicate the behaviour of states, and states too have a responsibility to protect civilian lives. And over time, I think they've become more cognizant and more responsible about doing so. But still, we routinely do see gross violations of civilian rights in the conduct by states as well.
Well, let's get Dr. Jerrold Post into the debate here, and good to have you with us, sir. I guess if there hasn't been a change in definition, if you agree with Dr. Richardson, perhaps the way the word is being used now is different. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's always been a loaded term, and to call someone a terrorist in some ways is almost a diagnosis that rests, as some have pointed out, with the state in power. So it's a struggle for legitimacy, but I quite agree with Dr. Richardson, and I must say it's a great pleasure to be on with my esteemed colleague, that the definition really has not changed, and a critical aspect is the separation of the target of violence, the non-combatant or the innocent victim, from the audience of influence. And the media plays a crucial role in communicating that message, the design to terrorize or intimidate another audience in order to gain that political, religious, or ideological goal.
Well, Dr. Post, let me put an email question we got to you from Texas here in the USA, and Wendy Taylor wrote in saying, a terrorist in America is defined as anyone the government determines is a threat to national security. Even daring to send this email, informing the world of just how unjust America is becoming, could potentially result in me being classified as a terrorist. The world needs to know the line between freedom fighter and terrorist is getting narrower each day, and it has nothing to do with violence. Now, has that line narrowed, or is it simply a question of perspective?
I think we really do have to be extremely careful in that our zealous pursuit of terrorism not having us degrade the very civil liberties that we are fighting for.
Dr. Richardson, if I could put another email we got here from California to you. David Fertig wrote in saying, I'd say a terrorist is one who seeks to cause terror for the sake of it, rather than one who is a combatant in a struggle over territory, resources or socio-political aims. But who accredits the legitimacy of political struggle? The combatants, the people living among the combat, or the press?
Well, I would argue that there's more to it than that terrorists rarely use violence for the sake of it. In fact, definitionally, I think they're using violence for an objective. It may be a political objective, but it may not be. It may be a transformational objective, whether it's bringing about the apocalypse or replacing, destroying capitalism, as was the case by many of the groups in the 1970s. So terrorists have a range of different goals. And just to go back for a moment to this freedom fighter question, to suggest that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, or vice versa, is to confuse ends with means. Freedom is a goal that some terrorists seek and that some non-terrorists seek, but it's quite a separate issue what the goal is and whether or not somebody is a terrorist. As to who legitimizes terrorism, I think the international community should cohere around delegitimizing the deliberate targeting of civilians for any objective.
Actually, Dr. Richardson, if I could ask you, how would you explain the rise in violent acts that have taken place, the increase in suicide bombings, for example, certainly in the last, say, 5 to 10 years?
Well, in my view, the American war on terror, which I think was a tragic and colossal mistake, terror is an emotion, terrorism is a tactic, so it makes no more sense to declare war on the tactic of terrorism than on any other tactic. And I think largely as a result of our foreign policy, we have served to recruit lots of young men, and indeed increasingly women, to the ranks of terrorist organizations. So I think there has been part of certainly in Iraq, the wave of terrorism in Iraq is a deliberate response to our policy of invasion there. So the overall explanation is a complex one, but at least part of the escalation is due to a response to our response to the attacks of September 11th.
And Dr. Post, I was reading that the attacks now in Iraq, certainly the suicide bombings, the number has gone up beyond any other suicide bombings that have taken place in any other sort of range of conflicts, all combined. And I wonder, considering your book and the study you've made of the mind of people who commit these kind of acts, what do you think is seriously behind what's the serious motivation for someone to take their own life in order to make a point?
We had the opportunity of interviewing some incarcerated suicide bombers, suicide bomb dispatchers, and one of the striking things for one of the major dispatchers that I interviewed was he became quite angry when we used the very phrase suicide bomber. This is not suicide. Suicide is weak, it is selfish, it is mentally disturbed. This is istishahad, meaning martyrdom or self-sacrifice in the service of Allah. So from their point of view, they are carrying out a martyrdom operation for the sake of the cause. And one of the things I've been particularly struck by is the degree to which the collective identity has become increasingly important, and their own individuality doesn't matter, and they have been persuaded, often by hate-mongering leaders, to give of their own lives in order to advance the cause.
Now, it's interesting, as you're describing the situation with those who have got, say, perhaps a religious basis, and you're using the example of Muslim suicide bombers. The suicide bombing is a tactic that's been used elsewhere, Sri Lanka, for example, people who aren't necessarily of the Muslim faith. So if you're applying the rules in this case, there's a religious belief here, would you say that applies in the other cases too?
I've looked at that, and it's a very interesting point. As I see it, for them, pursuing their national goals has almost become a religious faith, and their leader, who is very much a charismatic leader, if he defines this as advancing their cause, they will give up their lives for that cause. So it is almost a matter of religion with a little small case R.
So jingoistic almost, I mean, but patriotism to an extreme, taken to almost religious.
Well, I guess that's a way of thinking of it, but more importantly, their primary identity is as a fighter for that cause.
Dr. Richardson, I have to ask you, I've spoken to a number of people who say that, you know, people who commit some of these acts of violence, and particularly in the case of suicide bombings, it's not a case of, it's not as simple as impoverished people, easily motivated, easily turned. In many cases, it's educated, well-off, you know, upper middle class people who are involved in these kinds of acts. And I wonder, from your perspective, how much of a challenge that poses when trying to identify, from a point of security, the kind of people who might be motivated into turning to these sort of acts.
Well, I think the evidence is fairly clear that those who commit suicide terrors cannot be pigeonholed as the poor or the desperate. Some indeed are poor, but many are not. Many are professionals. Increasingly, you see, there was a time in which they were predominantly young men. This is less true. Increasingly, women, professionals, even parents. So it becomes extremely difficult to identify who might become a suicide terrorist. Indeed, if there's one thing that most of the experts on terrorism would agree around, it is precisely on the difficulty of producing a terrorist profile. Terrorists are human beings like the rest of us, with emotions, sensibilities, beliefs like the rest of us. So there aren't monsters in our midst that we need to identify. There are people who are prepared to take extreme acts in furtherance of a cause which they consider legitimate. So in that sense, it's enormously difficult to identify them as individuals.
Dr. Post, I know you want to make a point on this. Let me get in Jebrin from Chad, though, who's joining us on the line, and it's good to have you on the phone with us. Jebrin, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, just want to ask, you know, if the definition of the terrorism is, you know, killing civilian people, you know, targetedly, so what's, you know, your guest, you know, called what's America doing in Iraq, in Afghanistan? They are targeting civilians, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jebrin, let me ask Dr. Post this, because again this topic comes up with a lot of people. It comes down to perspective, and a lot of people see America's actions, for example, as our caller here says, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, as, in their definition, terrorism.
That's a very complex question. I find there to be a significant difference between targeting non-combatant individuals, civilians, and some of the unfortunate damage that can occur when one is attacking a known terrorist base or a known enemy target, and there are unfortunate civilian deaths. The horrifying aspect about terrorism is its extra normality. They are purposefully attacking civilians. Having said that, I'm certainly not going to get into a quarrel over U.S. policy. It might be useful. The last slide shows
see if we have let's see if one of
Abu
our pictures
Ghraib.
Abu Ghraib
shows a case where U.S. loss of respect for human rights has become a major recruitment vehicle for the terrorists. This has rocketed around radical Islamist websites, of which there are now some 5,000, and is major recruitments. We're not just talking about a war of words, we're talking about deeds. And whenever the United States or other nations cross that boundary, that strengthens the terrorist resistance.
Dr. Richardson, what's your reaction to the reports in the British newspapers that Jonathan Powell, a former aide to Tony Blair, has just recently called for what he said would want to find a channel to Al-Qaeda? He's called for talks with Al-Qaeda and Taliban as being the only real way to create a long-term end to the campaign of violence there.
Well, I think engaging with one's adversaries makes sense. I think states have been very reluctant to do so for fear of conveying legitimacy to their adversaries, but I would think cases that have been successful, and clearly Mr. Powell is extrapolating from the Northern Ireland experience, and the ability to do so I think is limited. Nevertheless, I do think it makes sense to try to engage our adversaries. The difficulty in engaging with Al-Qaeda is because of the success, such as it is, of the American counter-terrorist campaigns. We have severely damaged Al-Qaeda Central to the point where the main threat posed by Al-Qaeda to us now is much more diffuse. It's in its inspirational potential. And given that, it's very hard to identify who it is one would speak to. Though I certainly hope that the American forces in Iraq, for example, are engaging with their adversaries on the ground there as a way of opening lines of communications, because I think this notion that we never talk to terrorists has always historically, thankfully, been more honoured in the breach, and so it should be.
Dr. Post, your view on that?
As Dr. Richardson points out, negotiating was a crucial aspect with the IRA, but it was conditional, and the IRA had to begin to be considering its disarmament and gaining access to the media, as Margaret Thatcher so eloquently pointed out. The media is the oxygen on which the terrorists breathe. That was only permitted once they became involved in the peace process. To think about Hamas now as an interesting example, it's very difficult for Israel to negotiate with an adversary that denies its right to exist, and they would be glad to negotiate once that primary precondition is there.
Now, I know you advocate the use of open democracy as a way to counter terrorism by empowering those who take a non-violent approach, and certainly a more politically engaged approach to a conflict. But an email we had from Colorado in the USA, Muhammad Abdullah says, why has there been no debate in the press regarding the fact that the democratically elected Hamas in Palestine was not recognized? Does this reveal that the West is not really concerned with the democratic process, but rather about maintaining power that they can control and influence?
Well, the recognition would be depending upon living up to the compact among civilized nations and carrying on rocket attacks from Gaza and using terrorism as its main technique is inconsistent with what is expected from a nation state.
Now, in terms of the kind of response, when the response by Israel into Gaza, for example, has been criticized by the international community as way over the top, as far exceeding the measured response that they might otherwise use, how can then Israel be judged by what it's doing in return?
We have a competition of victimhoods in some ways, where each side justifies its violence as caused by the other. What is proportionate response becomes a very complicated matter.
Let's see if we can get a quick call in. We've got a minute to go, and from London we have the caller Khan on the line. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
I'm Khan from London. I'd like to ask your guest a question. I don't know his name.
Very quickly, please.
Any of the gentlemen there with the suit there.
Yeah, please go on.
He keeps on calling these people who are fighting against the American forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq. He keeps on calling them terrorists. Why they're terrorists? They are defending their country.
Okay, let's get Dr. Post a quick chance to respond. Sorry, 30 seconds to go, sir.
Again, one can, as Dr. Richardson points out, be strongly for peace, strongly for, as I am, for example, a separate Palestinian state, for concord, but nevertheless deplore the targeting of innocent civilians and non-combatants. And that's the distinction. Right. I think we can be for causes and yet deplore this dreadful technique.
Well, Dr. Post, I have to thank you there. And Dr. Louise Richardson, thank you very much for joining us as well. We've run out of time in this debate. We hope to touch on it again. Thank you.
Thank you.
On tomorrow's show, a state of the US economy and the effect it's having on the rest of the world. Send your emails to us. We'll see you next time. Don't forget, Street Talk is coming up next.